Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Security Studies, and welcome to those from the online audience who are joining us today. Just before we begin, I'm going to give a few procedural notes. For those of you who are coming to ISS for the first time, the restrooms are out the hallway and to the left. The other thing is we would not be under Chatham House rules today, so and we will be broadcasting on YouTube live the entire session. So please, if you have a question at some point, do not hesitate to use the microphone, because we would need the microphone so that the online audience could also key into what we are doing. This morning, we're going to be talking about long-term development prospect for Mozambique and Namibia. And this seminar is basically the product of two research papers that we're also going to be launching today. One of them by a team including Zach Donenfeld, and the other by a team including Yaki Cilliers. I am sure that Yaki is a well-known face here. He might not need presentation, but I'm going to present him regardless. Yaki was the co-founder of the Institute for Security Studies. He is the head of the ISS Board of Trustees currently, and he was the first executive director of this organization until 2015. And he also is the current head of the African Futures and Innovations team, which is based out here in Pretoria. Zach Donenfeld is a researcher in the African Futures and Innovations team, and he will be speaking to, and he has a lot of experience working with long-term development prospects and specifically the Sustainable Development Goals. So this morning, and I am Fonte Akum, Senior Researcher in the Peace and Security Research Program here at ISS. This morning, we would be trying to have a very engaging discussion looking at long-term development prospects in two countries whose development outlooks right now could not look more different. Mozambique and Namibia, sorry. I'm trapped in my own research here. So before we go ahead, each speaker would have 20 minutes to present their report. And at the end of each presentation, they would have a short video to accompany it. After each presentation, we would go through a series of questions from the audience to which they would engage, and then we would try to wrap it up within the 2 hours that are allocated to us. So these research papers were actually funded with the assistance of Irish Aid and the Hans Seidel Foundation, which we would like to acknowledge heartily out here. We would also like to acknowledge the support of the other members of the ISS Partnership Forum, which include the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America. I would not want to take up too much time with the presentation because I'm sure you're more interested in the content of these reports. So without much ado, Zach, would you take a first stab at Namibia?
Thank you very much, Fonte, and thank you all for joining us here today. It's always nice to see a group of people engaged in our work, so thank you very much. As Fonte said, my name is Zach Donenfeld. I'm a researcher with the African Futures and Innovation Program, and what we do at AFI is we try to get people to think a little differently, a little more structurally about how the world is unfolding. To do this, we use a tool called the International Futures Forecasting System, which I will refer to as IFS throughout this presentation. In terms of the structure of this presentation, I'll briefly discuss a bit of our methodology and how that forecasting tool works, and how we, I think it's useful to think about how we try and think about the future as a set of three key questions. So we want to look at the history of a country, right? Where are we and how did we get here today? then it's also useful to get a sense of where we're heading. So based on those historical trends and this data, where do we think we're headed in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And then finally, the key question is, where do we want to be, right? And how do we get there? So I'll break this presentation down into kind of those 3 sections before wrapping up with a quick conclusion and a video before we move on to discussion. So International Futures, as I mentioned, is a massive data repository. We have about 3,600 variables for 186 countries, going back as far as the data is available, in some cases as far back as 1960. So this helps us form a kind of a picture of where we're at today. It also helps us understand how human, social, environmental, and physical systems interact over time. And then the scenario development tool helps us shape the way we want to address the major problems that we're facing and improve outcomes across a range of development systems. So the tool is structured as follows. We have a demographic module that's based off the UN Population Division forecast. We have an economics module. We take data from the World Bank and the IMF. We also use a social accounting matrix to better account for the trade-offs in government spending. There's an education model where we get data from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. We have a health model that we've been working with the World Health Organization to develop. We have an infrastructure model. This is one of the areas of the tool that's actually unique. We have actually have a demand component to our infrastructure model, which to our knowledge isn't available elsewhere. Then we have an agriculture model, an energy model, an environment model, a technology model, and then we have our social systems, so governance, finance, and international politics. And these systems are all connected in the tool. So the example we like to use here is population, right? To forecast population, you only really need to know 4 things: the current age, sex distribution of the population, births, deaths, and migration. But births are affected by, among other things, levels of female education and access to contraceptives. Deaths are affected by, among other things, the prevalence of communicable diseases and things like access to clean water and improved sanitation. So all of these systems interact to produce a dynamic forecast of how these systems will unfold over time. And we are talking about Namibia today. So where's Namibia today, and how did they get there? Since independence in 1990, Namibia has made remarkable progress across a number of development indicators. Poverty has been reduced by from more than 50% of the population to less than 20% today. Access to clean water has increased from about 70% in 1990 to more than 90% today. The country has averaged about 4.5% growth per year, which is well above the average for other upper middle income countries, and even about a percentage point higher than the African average. Finally, the country has relatively good rankings on governance and equality. If you compare it to other upper middle income countries, it scores fairly highly on things like the World Bank's Governance Effectiveness Measure, Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, and other similar metrics. But we did identify some areas where the country is underperforming, and we think that those are some key leverage points for the government of Namibia to improve development outcomes. So what are these areas? One area that jumps out is the average years of education. As you can see in this graph here, what this is showing is average years of education relative to GDP per capita. So these relative comparisons I'm about to present are sort of where we would expect Namibia to be is somewhere along that line. Anywhere below that line indicates what we would call maybe underperformance. So what this is showing is that even though GDP per capita in Namibia and Tunisia is fairly similar, people in Tunisia have more than 1 year of education on average than people in Namibia. So similarly, in terms of access to calories, GDP per capita in Namibia is about 5 or 6 times as large as Chad's. However, people in Chad have about the same level of access to calories as people in Namibia. This is, an obvious issue in terms of the forward connections to health, education, and productivity that can result from a prolonged deficiency of calories. This is showing access to improved sanitation in Namibia and other African countries. Even though Namibia's GDP per capita is about 8 times as large as Malawi's, people in Malawi actually have better access to improved sanitation facilities than people in Namibia. So these are 3 of the key areas that we've kind of identified through our research and that we think are useful leverage points for the government of Namibia to focus on. So, where do we think we're going in the next 15 or 20 years? These are some current path forecasts of demographic trends. In terms of demographics, there are 2 kind of separate but related issues. Fertility rates in Namibia are well above other upper middle income countries and also well above regional peer countries. When I say regional peer countries, who I'm referring to is South Africa and Botswana. They were used throughout the paper as a kind of reference group. Also, the dashed lines represent Namibia here. So these persistently high fertility rates lead to what we refer to as the youth bulge. Now, this is the percentage of the population between 15 and 29 relative to the population over the age of 15. And we see this dotted line remaining persistently high until after 2020. In terms of education, we already have seen that average educational attainment in Namibia is somewhat below what would be expected relative to its level of economic development. Although education outcomes do improve in Namibia, the gap between Namibia and upper middle income Africa does not close all that much in the duration of the forecast, and it remains almost constant with regional peers. This slide is not so much of a forecast. It's showing death rates by communicable and non-communicable diseases in 2016 in Namibia. The trend that I think this graph is useful for is that if you look at the age cohorts up to 49, you see communicable diseases in Namibia outstripping other upper middle income countries. This is not surprising given how severe the AIDS epidemic has been in Southern Africa. It's also, the communicable disease burden on the continent is consistently higher than peer countries. What's important to point out here, though, is in these upper age categories, deaths from non-communicable diseases in Namibia are actually happening at a higher rate than in other upper middle income countries. What this is pointing to is a shift in the disease burden towards non-communicable diseases. And the reason that's important is because non-communicable diseases are significantly more expensive to treat, diagnose, and manage, and they require completely different health systems than communicable diseases. So while it's important to focus on communicable diseases, that has unintended consequences. So we try and express this as a way of saying that it helps, it's necessary to prepare for the future leading causes of diseases. And the sooner you eradicate communicable diseases, the more of a problem non-communicable diseases become. So what we've kind of seen in our research is this diverging trend of economic growth and service delivery. So while we forecast GDP per capita to grow from being the 11th highest in Africa today to the 9th highest by 2040, we also forecast access to improved sanitation to drop from the 26th lowest today to the 30th lowest by 2040. And this masks another trend that I kind of touched on earlier, is the relatively good rankings of the Namibian government. The rankings may be good, but the trend is a little ominous, because if you look at like the governance effectiveness, for instance, Namibia is the 11th most effective government in the upper middle income country group, according to the World Bank. It was 5th in 1990. Similarly, in the Regulatory Quality Index, it's 24th today, but it was 12th in 1990. Transparency International shows a similar trend, 8th today, down from 3rd in 1990. So I think we should kind of interpret those rankings a bit cautiously. So finally, what this research is meant to highlight are strategies for improving human development in Namibia. What gives you the biggest kind of bang for your buck? Now, what I'm about to show is the change from our current path forecast from investing in certain areas of development. So we have an expectation of where Namibia might be in 2040. This is showing the difference if we invest in certain things. So what is shown on the y-axis, so the vertical axis, is the percentage change in extreme poverty from where we think Namibia would be in 2040 if you make these different investments. The horizontal axis is showing the percentage change in GDP, and then the bubble size is the percentage reduction in infant mortality. So there's a lot of ways to interpret this graph. We don't like to say which investment is necessarily best, because that depends on what your criteria for success is, right? We think poverty reduction, economic growth, and infant mortality are fairly useful indicators for a number of reasons, but policymakers and development practitioners may have other metrics that they care more about. So these kind of need to be interpreted with a grain of salt. But we do see very significant returns from investing in primary education, child and maternal mortality, improving crop yields, improved sanitation, and then the HIV/AIDS intervention has positive effects on GDP growth and infant mortality. It has a somewhat counterintuitive impact of actually increasing the number of people living in poverty. This happens because communicable diseases tend to disproportionately affect people in vulnerable communities. So successful health interventions often have they're kind of victims of their own success, right? They have unintended consequences, like I was trying to describe earlier with the onset of non-communicable diseases. So it's useful to get a sense of what investing in any one development area can do, but we also like to show the impact of combining these interventions, right? So what if the government of Namibia invested in improved sanitation along with clean water and other forms of infrastructure to kind of simulate a big push on infrastructure or a big push on health? So these are the results of the combined scenarios. You see a really big payoff from improved family planning on poverty, but it actually reduces GDP. So again, this is another example of trade-offs in policy making. Just one more brief example of trade-offs. We simulated this integrated development push. So this is what happens if Namibia invests across all these systems simultaneously. Another problem Namibia faces, along with HIV/AIDS, is the fairly significant levels of inequality that exist in Namibia, along with Botswana and South Africa. But we thought it would be maybe not right to write a paper without addressing that issue. So this household transfers intervention is meant to simulate basically a cash transfers program. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because when you layer the cash transfers program on top of this integrated development push intervention, the reduction on infant mortality is actually lower. So you're taking money away from other development priorities, and that's not to say that reducing inequality isn't important. We were just, again, illustrating that there are trade-offs to government spending decisions. Now, finally, I see Fonte is asking me to wrap it up. I have one more slide and then the video. So, as I mentioned, it's important to not get too absorbed in focusing on one development metric or one measure of improvement. So what we've done here is demonstrate the impact of the sectoral scenarios across a slightly wider basket of indicators, just to give you a sense of which interventions do strongly in which areas. So with that, I think I will put the video on and wrap up.
Namibia has significant potential for human development. The country is already upper middle income and has extensive natural resources such as diamonds, gold, and uranium. It has plentiful fisheries, a large natural gas field, a small population, and some of the most ideal conditions for renewable energy on the planet. Since independence, Namibia has achieved economic growth of about 4.5% per year, reduced poverty, and also improved access to clean water. But compared to other upper-middle-income countries, Namibia has the lowest access to improved sanitation facilities, fewest years of average education, and the highest proportion of children suffering from undernutrition. The question now is, how can Namibia capitalize on its natural resources to promote rapid human development? To help answer this, the African Futures Project used the International Futures Forecasting System, IFS, to model various policies aimed at improving human development in Namibia through to 2040. Our analysis shows that Namibia could see significant benefits from investing in access to sanitation, boosting agricultural yields, improving primary school outcomes, and reducing maternal and child mortality. These policies all produce gains across a number of important areas of human well-being. The scenarios that involve a coordinated policy push across development systems deliver by far the most impressive overall returns. But those scenarios also reveal that there are competing priorities in any policy decision. For instance, improving family planning drives the steepest reduction in extreme poverty of any single policy, but also shrinks the size of the economy relative to the country's current trajectory. This happens because the intervention shrinks the size of the population and therefore the number of people available to produce and consume goods and services. Using tools like IFS can help policymakers better understand these types of trade-offs. Our analysis recommends that Namibia should invest in health extension programs that address communicable as well as non-communicable diseases. Increase the flow of students through the education pipeline by investing at all levels of the education system. Improve access to family planning programs to reduce population growth and the associated pressures on service delivery. Improve the efficiency of the agricultural sector. Improve the quality of governance and reduce inequality. For details on these and other recommended interventions to build a sustainable Namibia, visit www.issafrica.org.
Well, thank you, Zach, for that presentation, which was at the same time concise as it was thought-provoking for those who are looking to the future of Namibia. We saw a number of things from your presentation. That is, Namibia has done pretty good in experiencing sustained growth since independence in 1990. And it has shown relatively good governance over that period to date. However, it still faces a number of challenges in the area of primary education and in the health and sanitation sectors. Zach, hoping I'm not abusing my privilege of chair, I would want you to expand a little bit more on the prospect for Namibia maintaining its current governance trajectory and its relationship to long-term inequality. And I would throw that at you together with opening the floor for further questions. I know that was a lot of information. The publications are available outside as well for those who would want to read up on them and have more incisive questions. But I'm sure you have other questions now, so please.
Thank you very much. My name is Derek Christian, retired naval officer. But the question's not about the Navy. Your graphs on the GDP per capita with the various other countries that are shown. I noticed you didn't highlight where South Africa fits into those graphs. And I thought it might have been useful as a South African to see relatively where we fit into Namibia or vice versa, just to see what the picture would be overall. Thank you.
Hello, this is Tai Chun with China Economic Daily. I have a question. How does African countries like Namibia prepare for the fourth industrial revolution and this shock to the possible job losses? Yeah, I hope it's clear.
Good morning. I am Arshad Abbasi. I am a diplomat, third secretary from Pakistan High Commission in Pretoria. It's a good presentation, thought-provoking one. I have noticed one incompatibility or sort of dichotomy that Namibia has maintained good governance since its independence. I mean, a measure of good governance. But on the other hand, there is like, so to say, unsustained or unsustainable health, education, and sanitation. So, I mean, what can explain this dichotomy? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that first round of questions on industrialization, comparison to South Africa, and the dichotomy between good governance and service delivery. Zach?
Thank you, Fonte, and thank you for those questions. I think maybe it's easiest to just address them in order. In terms of how does Namibia fit in with South Africa, Derek, there are a lot of similarities and some important differences. South Africa definitely has higher access to improved sanitation. They definitely have higher average years of education. But there are a lot of areas that are similar. Access to clean water is about the same the inequality is similar. Both countries have been devastated by the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So I think that those are the inequality and the HIV/AIDS. I think are the two overarching issues in which all kind of policy decisions in those two countries have to consider. And that, I mean, maybe that kind of leads into the next question about the fourth industrial revolution and how do countries like South Africa and Namibia, who have relatively high GDP per capitas, but this massive inequality, how do they handle this technological change? And this is a very contentious issue among people at the ISS. We are very interested in how this is going to unfold. My sense is that if a country like South Africa or Namibia wants to move into the manufacturing sector, their big advantage is the low cost of labor. And it's going to be really difficult to reconcile policies aimed at reducing that inequality with policies aimed at attracting any kind of substantial manufacturing sector. And I think that is a really important trade-off for people to consider because, and maybe I'll borrow a metaphor from our former a colleague of Yaki and mine. So think of manufacturing as a bridge, right? It's not a goal. Your goal is to get to the other side of the river. That's where Norway is, that's where the United States is, and manufacturing is the way there. Now, if I'm standing on the other side of the river and I know that bridge is the only way that anybody's ever gotten to the other side, but I also know that bridge is going to explode while I'm walking across it, I'm going to find another way to the other side of the river, even if nobody's ever done it before. And I think that's how countries like South Africa and Argentina and Namibia kind of have to be considering their industrial policies. The trend of automation is coming. Nobody can say for sure when it is going to really affect a country like South Africa and Namibia, but I think investing in a traditional manufacturing sector is a gamble for those countries, and they should be thinking about the future kind of with the assistance of these kind of tools. So that's my take on how the fourth industrial revolution will impact upper middle income countries. I think the dichotomy between good governance and service delivery, I think the way you explain that is in Namibia's relative decline in those governance rankings, right? I mean, they've slid 12 or 15 spots, depending on the indicator you're looking at. And I think with every year that service delivery fails to continue to improve, you'll see Namibia slide further and further down those rankings. Now, that's an easy problem to fix. Well, it's not easy, but I think there are ways that the government of Namibia can improve that trend and start translating economic growth into improved governance and improved service delivery, and I think that is that's how I would explain that that divergence.
Thanks, Zach, for those responses. You have a quote here that says, research indicates that countries with a youth bulge higher than 40% are more than twice as likely to experience conflict. Namibia has this growing youth bulge, and they have experienced relatively good governance over the past few years. How then do they manage this youth bulge, especially with the natural resource endowments that you see? Are they likely to experience conflict? Is inequality likely to cause further problems in changing the governance trajectory in Namibia?
Thank you for your non-loaded question. I mean, SWAPO enjoys broad support from the Namibian public. I think people, and they have, like, I started my presentation with a lot of things that have gone well in Namibia in the last 25 years. There are a lot more things that I didn't mention. There have been successful public housing programs, and the government has made it a priority to invest in sanitation improvements, although I would argue that those plans may not have been really wholeheartedly implemented, but I think the government is aware that these are issues. But on the other hand, you have high and rising unemployment, a large youth population that is becoming increasingly urban, where service delivery is poor. Service delivery is slightly better in urban areas, but there's drawbacks and there's advantages and drawbacks of rapid urbanization. Now, having a lot of people in one space could make service delivery easier, but if those people assemble into these large, complicated, informal settlements, then it becomes much, much, much more difficult to provide those areas with services, because you need to uproot hundreds or thousands of people to do that, and that's not always easy to do from a number of standpoints. So, I think that the government should be aware that it has broad support, but it should also be aware that that support has been kind of stagnating, if not declining slightly, and there are a lot of what we would call structural drivers of instability. This large youth bulge, high inequality, so divergence between economic growth and service delivery. All these factors, I think, are things that the government should pay attention to.
Well, we're open to the second round of questions.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. My name is Veiko Ngiwete, Namibian High Commissioner to South Africa. I have both question and comment. One is that our president, since day one, he declared war against poverty. And to address this poverty problem in the society, we decided that we have to improve the economic development, especially in terms of strengthening our manufacturing industry. We still have to do that because we produce what we don't consume, and we consume that we don't produce. Many things comes in from South Africa, but that has been steadily improving. You find a very serious challenge in balancing the issue of economic development versus population growth. Higher employment, in the chart we have seen that there's a recommendation to improve on that population growth, means to control it. But at the same time, when you promote investment, the first in question is, what is your population? Your population is very small, and therefore it is not beneficial to our business. That's one challenge. How do you balance that aspect? Here, you have a population that we feel is growing, or we are told we must control it, But at the same time, the investors will say, we will not be interested unless you are really talking about in terms of the regional market. But if it's just internal market, it's very, very small. The other challenge is we have seen on the graph that we need to improve on the crop production, for instance. Then the other challenge is on the energy sector. We find that there's a competition between the two sectors. While we want to see Namibia becoming self-sufficient food production, then we are also dependent on the rain. Most of our crops, most of our farmers are depending on the rain fed. We do not have rivers, perennial rivers, or else you are talking about groundwater. To produce that enough supply of water, you rely on the energy. Energy is very expensive. At the same time, that's why I'm saying there is competing, notion here between the two sectors. You want to produce enough food, the electricity you cannot afford in terms of irrigation. What could be a recommendation on these two sectors to talk to each other? I can go on and on, but due to the time sector, I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Any more questions? Well, Zach, you have a lot of issues to touch upon there, and it might be important as well to kind of paint a little picture of the current contribution to Namibia's GDP. What sectors are contributing highest to the GDP, and do those sectors need to be improved or drawn back, or are there more sectors that could add to the GDP, contributing to the GDP in the long term?
Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner. I will do my best to cover everything you brought up. Look, I think economic growth is a necessary but insufficient condition for poverty reduction. So I have no problem with an economic strategy that aims, that sets a GDP target or GDP growth target as its goal. I just think that those strategies need to be complemented by policies that are specifically aimed at poverty reduction, because economic growth by itself, we've seen South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia all have fairly good economic growth rates, but they also have some of the most severe inequality in the world. And I think you need very intentional policies to reconcile those two things. I can't say whether or not investing in manufacturing is a good idea or a bad idea. I think I've articulated my concerns about that. Now, there's a window in which you could develop a manufacturing industry, and if you could convince investors that it's viable to expand beyond the Namibian market, then I think, if you think you can do that, then there's nothing inherently wrong about a manufacturing industry either. The population growth issue is tricky. We think about population growth as it relates to service delivery. Fewer people, all things being equal, means that it will be easier for the government to provide those people with goods or with services. There are also obvious benefits to having a large population. China's population is undoubtedly the driving force behind its ascendance, and their maturing population will create problems for them in the future. So I think every country has to think about demographics. Europe is going to have a massive dependency ratio issue. There are not going to be enough people working in Europe to support the number of people on pensions and the number of young people in the future. And Europe is going to have to figure out policies to reconcile that. Namibia has a different challenge. You know, I don't think that Namibia has to reduce fertility rates, but I do think it would make providing services to its population easier on the government. And then how to the water, food, energy nexus. I actually think there's a lot of potential for Namibia to move into renewable energy. Given the vast geography of the country, how sparsely populated it is, you know, there's a few population centers. But I don't know that it really makes sense to invest in a national electricity grid. I think distributed generation from solar, wind, and biomass has a ton of potential in Namibia. I mean, you can produce energy locally, you can you don't have to have that massive capital investment in distribution and transmission networks that you would need from a traditional electricity grid. Now, there are also trade-offs. If you're looking to develop a manufacturing industry, like renewables aren't necessarily sufficient, and you'll need to supplement that with gas or generators or whatever. But I'm a renewable energy optimist in general, but I think it makes all the sense in the world for Namibia to move in that direction, given how far away the population centers are from each other, and that you're not talking about a massive amount of megawatts, so you don't need a ton of capacity to get it off the ground. So that's how I would reconcile the agriculture, water, energy problem.
Thank you for posing those questions, and thank you, Zach, for your concise responses to those questions. And you'd be able to ask more questions and engage with Zach further outside once we're done with the seminar. We would like to shift gears from potential to optimism, and from Namibia to Mozambique. Mozambique's development prospects look fairly bright, despite the fact that its current economic indicators are pretty dismal. And they've been going through a number of political and governance challenges as well, which Dr. Yaki Cilier, who doesn't need any further presentation, is going to help us understand exactly the potential pitfalls of Mozambique falling into the normal resource curse with the discovery of this large natural gas reserves. Thank you, Yaki.
Thank you very much, Fonte. Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa are upper middle income countries. Mozambique is a low income country. And as I'm going to show, there are significant differences between Namibia and Mozambique. So let's look at the prospects and challenges and Mozambique's growth and human development outlook to 2040. I am going to give you very briefly a purpose and process. Zach has already introduced the International Futures Forecasting Tool. We use the same tool for the Mozambique paper. I'm going to say a few words about the current path of Mozambique, where it is apparently headed, present a few scenarios, and conclude with a few next steps and a video. So we did the study for Mozambique for Irish Aid, and it included a number of visits and on-site engagement with experts in Mozambique. And similar to the Namibian study, we used IFS to support development assistance planning for the Irish Embassy. and then firstly analyze their progress in a historical and regional context, looking where Mozambique has come from and where apparently it is headed in comparison to its regional peers. And we use the same terminology. We look at a current path forecast where Mozambique appears to be headed, including, of course, the rich discoveries in terms of gas, and then looked at alternative policy interventions that could shift that development trajectory. So since Zach has already spoken about the IFS tool, let me immediately move on to the current path forecast of where Mozambique is coming from and where it is headed. Now, there are important differences between Mozambique and Namibia. And while Zach was speaking, I was wondering if any of this speaks to the differences between Portuguese colonialism and South African colonialism. And I think it's an interesting area to investigate. But let's first look at population, and I'll start with total fertility rates. This is a history of fertility rates in Mozambique and a number of peers, in this case Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and looking at total fertility rates from 1960 until 2015. And on the one side, it is births per woman. Now, at the moment, as we can see, and this is Mozambique, births per fertile woman in 2016 is about 5.1. That's significant. It is high. It is also coming down more slowly than that of its regional peers, although from a slightly lower base. This is a slide that shows Mozambique's current population size from 1990 and includes a forecast to 2040. And it includes that for different population cohort sizes. So it's those that are under 15, look at the size of that young cohort. The median age in Mozambique is 17. That means half of Mozambicans are below 17 and half are over 17. Extremely young population. We look at those from 15 to 30, from 30 to 65, and they're very small elderly population. So Mozambique, the 2017 line, has about 29 million people at the moment. Its population is growing at about 2.5% per annum out to 2040, which means that by 2040, Mozambique will have about 53 million people. 53 million, from 29 million people today to 53 million. That is a significant increase in population size. That means Mozambique by 2040 will have about the size that South Africa is today. South Africa is about 55 million, 56 million people. So Mozambique, moves from the country with the 12th largest population in Africa to the country with the 10th largest population in Africa, because it is such a young population, such high fertility rates. So this also means that Mozambique has a large and growing youth bulge. Youth bulge we define as the size of the population from 15 to 29 years relative to the rest of the population. This has certain stability implications for Mozambique. A young population, a large youth bulge, means that you have more social turbulence than would be the case if you had a lower population, youth bulge. So Mozambique has made progress, but it has suffered from chronic underdevelopment. It has averaged about 7% growth over the past 20 years. 7% growth over the past 20 years. Yet it is the 4th lowest on the Human Development Index score in the world. Life expectancy has increased by over 10 years. And primary enrollment has increased by 60%. But it has the 3rd lowest level of educational attainment in the world. It has almost the lowest life expectancy in the world and very high levels of fertility. There are a few countries in the world, a few countries in Africa that have the levels of fertility, the high levels of fertility that Mozambique has. It has low access to basic infrastructure, water, sanitation, and electricity. And over 65% of the population live in extreme poverty. And we define extreme poverty by living below $1.90 per person per day. Yet, as we all know, there is significant optimism about Mozambique looking ahead because of its large natural gas reserves and production. But the point is that Mozambique is coming from a very, very low base. And the question really is if the investment in a high capital intensity sector will really spill over into the rest of Mozambique. Will it reduce poverty? Will it reduce inequality? Will it provide work? To be able to forecast what the impact of natural gas production will be on Mozambique, we consulted with experts in Mozambique and built into the current path forecast for Mozambique an expected gas production and growth forecast. Now, Mozambique is at the start of rolling out of massive gas. It's going to, eventually, it has the potential, Mozambique, of becoming the third largest liquid natural gas producer in the world. Significant findings. I think it's 3 trillion cubic meters that Mozambique has in potential gas reserves. So we built this forecast of of gas production and built that into the current path forecast for Mozambique. So we can look at, because that's where Mozambique probably is going to head. So this is in billion barrels of oil equivalent, and at the bottom is from 2015 till 2040, and this is what happens with natural gas production. So when we speak of a current path forecast for Mozambique, it includes that massive gas discovery and exploitation. The forecast is not what Mozambique is planning, or what the World Bank or the IMF is planning. We've actually reduced the time scale at which natural gas comes online quite a bit. We've moved things a little bit to the right, because these kind of projects very often don't deliver as planned. We believe that the initial onshore production will come online in 2023 and 2024, which is about 2 years later than what the IMF predicts, and that it will take about 8 years of construction out until 2033 for full production to come online. So you can see where the full production, 2033, comes on board. The impact of this massive development and investment will increase Mozambique's growth rate during that period while we are building, while the Mozambicans and foreign companies and so on is building this natural gas. The details of the forecast and the assumptions that are made are in the paper. So, including that in our forecast, what does this mean? Well, this is, for example, what happens with poverty in Mozambique. So on the left-hand side, we have percent of Mozambicans living in extreme poverty in Mozambique. It goes from about 65% of its population to about 35%. And on the right-hand side, we have the millions of Mozambicans living in extreme poverty. Remember, we have a very rapidly growing population. And we see that the absolute number of people living in poverty moves from about 19 to about 18.7 million people. Because you have such a massive growth in population size, the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty remains more or less the same. So while the percent goes down from 65 to 35%, the absolute number remains more or less the same. And you can see that the bars versus the percentage, the blue line. The current path forecast of the population in need of basic services and infrastructure. This now includes, remember, everything I'm showing you includes that massive gas production and the revenues that accrue from that. So let's look at the impact on primary and secondary aged children. 2016, there are 12.4 million Mozambicans that are primary and secondary aged kids. There are 14.1 million in 2022 and 18.7 million in 2040. If we then look at population without piped water, it in actual fact increases from 26 million to 32 million. So despite all this natural gas coming on board, in actual fact, the number of the population without piped water increases. The population without improved sanitation also increases in absolute numbers. The population without electricity increases from 22 million to 34 million. Population living in extreme poverty, I've already shown you that, stays more or less constant at about 19 million people. And population living in poverty, which is a higher benchmark, I think it's $2 a day, goes from 23 million, 24 million Mozambicans to about 27 million. So I think I've effectively answered the question. If gas production in Mozambique is going to be a panacea for development on the current growth forecast. And it is in actual fact a much less optimistic forecast than I think many of us would have expected, given the figures where I've started. And the reason basically is that you have a large country with a large, very young population. You have gas reserves that are concentrated in one area and that is going to benefit a small number of highly educated and highly skilled people and make a very small group of Mozambicans, give them employment and opportunity, but that it does very little without very coherent government intervention to the majority of Mozambique's population. So, same as with Namibia, we modeled a number of interventions to see what could we do to improve the situation. Now, what we did with the interventions is we did this for Irish Aid. So we said Irish Aid's got a 5-year planning horizon. So what we did is for those 5 years, we modeled an intervention, and then we looked what the impact of the intervention is in 2040. So the intervention is only for 5 years, from 2018 to 2022, and then we look at the impact over by 2040. And we did those interventions in education, health and nutrition, improved family planning and care, boosting agricultural production, and strengthening governance. Those 5 areas: education, health, family planning, agriculture, and strengthening governance. More or less the same areas that you saw that Zach spoke about. And then similar to what we did in Namibia, we grouped these interventions together to see what is the combined impact of a big push. And this is the same kind of graph that Zach presented, except it's got explanatory legends on the side. So on the left-hand side, we have the percent change in the people living in extreme poverty. On the bottom, the x-axis, we have the percent change in infant mortality, and the bubble size relates to the change in GDP per capita. And important, this compares where Mozambique would be by 2040 compared to where it could be with these 5 interventions. And then you can see the impact of the interventions. Now, clearly, an integrated development push obviously does better on all the 3 dimensions. The intervention that does the best in reducing poverty is boosting agricultural production. That shouldn't be any surprise. I think 70% of Mozambicans are involved in the subsistence agricultural sector. Infant mortality, the percent change in infant mortality, obviously improved family planning and care does the best with that. But as we see when we do combined interventions, the combined effect of a big push, what we refer to as an integrated development push, actually exceeds the sum of the individual interventions. May not be that clear. We can also see on the slide the effect that strengthening governance would have, advancing education, and extending health and nutrition. Now, one takeaway of, just to maybe present this in a different way. Remember, what I've shown you here are the individual intervention clusters plus the combined intervention, the integrated development push. We also did a generally negative intervention. This is where gas production stalls, development donors pull back, and so on. And what this graph shows you, from 2015 until 2050, it shows you the millions of Mozambicans that will live in extreme poverty under 3 scenarios. The first is the integrated, in the middle you can see the current path. This is a story I've told you of the fact that the number of Mozambicans that will live in extreme poverty it will decline over time, but it takes a long time because of the rapidly growing population. Under the integrated development push, the combined scenario that we showed you, there is a significant reduction in millions of people living in extreme poverty. And then we can see what happens in the stalled development scenario, which is the dashed line on the top, that sees that by 2040 Mozambique could have about 30 million people living in extreme poverty. Now, the growth rate here, the current path growth rate, is what we forecast, what Mozambique is going to grow, is about 7.1% on average. Remember that when Zach showed you Namibia's growth forecast. Now, Namibia is an upper middle income country. What, a 4.4%, Zach? Something like that.
Yeah, IMF is
4.2. Okay, so if Mozambique, which grows of a much lower path, average growth forecast for the current path, 7.1%. The growth in the integrated development push, average growth rate is about 7.7%. And these all have various impacts across different dimensions. The growth in the stall development scenario is about 5.9%. Now, as a South African, I can almost say, we wish that South Africa could grow at 5.9% and consider that a low development path. But we do not have we are not coming from the low level that Mozambique is coming, and we have a much more sophisticated economy, and we don't have the population momentum that Mozambique does have. So the paper concludes with a number of next steps and conclusions, similar to what Zach presented on Namibia, and the focus on basic human development and service delivery, the fact that population growth is a headwind, and certainly if Mozambique does not do something about its extremely high fertility rates, it really it cannot support the number of dependents that it has. The fact that natural gas production is not a panacea, I think this demonstrates the fact that so much more needs to be done if we are to change Mozambique's future prospects. In terms of our partnership with Irish Aid in Mozambique, we hope to train the Mozambican government on the use of the IFS tools so that they can integrate this in their systems, and hope to also work on a number of additional forecasts in Mozambique.
The recent discovery that Mozambique holds one of the largest reserves of natural gas in the world has generated great optimism for the country's future. But without a concerted effort to ensure transparent gas revenue management and investment in basic human development, the country will continue to face barriers to inclusive growth. Even with the significant economic boost from natural gas production, we forecast that Mozambique will have the same number of those living in extreme poverty in 2040 as it has today. The African Futures Project's report on the future of Mozambique uses the International Futures Forecasting System to assess Mozambique's long-term development prospects and help frame uncertainty around the future of natural gas, economic growth, and human well-being. Mozambique has grown rapidly over the last 20 years, but the country still has some of the lowest levels of human development in the world. Over 65% of the population lives in extreme poverty, and most of the country lacks access to basic infrastructure, health, and education. Only 5% of the population has completed a secondary education. Life expectancy is 5.5 years lower than the regional average, and 22 million Mozambicans have no access to improved sanitation facilities. We forecast that Mozambique will improve education, health, and infrastructure access over the next 20 years on its current path. But the country's growing population, which is forecast to nearly double by 2040, will make it increasingly difficult to extend basic services to the country's most vulnerable. But concerted efforts to improve family planning, extend health and nutrition services, and advance education outcomes will ensure that more of Mozambique's young population have the opportunity to live full, productive lives. Meanwhile, boosting agricultural production and improving governance could help ensure that economic growth translates into inclusive human development. In a scenario where Mozambique effectively manages gas extraction and ensures windfalls are used to advance human well-being, 4 million fewer people could be living in extreme poverty by 2040. If gas production is delayed or revenues are mismanaged, Mozambique could fall further into a vicious cycle of underdevelopment. In this scenario, where the country also fails to improve transparency and development outcomes, 11 million more people could be living in extreme poverty by 2040. The African Futures Project is a collaboration between the Institute for Security Studies and the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver. Find the full report on the ISS website.
Thank you, Yaki, for another thought-provoking presentation, where we were asking the question whether it's going to be a virtuous cycle of economic development or resource curse for Mozambique, given the discovery of this natural gas reserves. I'd like to open the floor for questions.
Mr. Sokasa from ICRC. I'd just like to know, mainly because I hear you've touched on mainly on the prospects and other things in terms of the potential of Mozambique, but now mainly I'd like to bring it back in terms of the security question when it comes to the upcoming talks between November and October, when it comes to Renamo and Frelimo, as to whether how optimistic are you about finding a lasting solution? And also, what impact could it have on the potential of the country should things not go right? That's good.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Lowe-Warden from the ISS. Yaki, a little bit to follow on that question, we know that today, Mozambique has got some challenges in terms of political stability, but also corruption. I presume that is part of your low road, but if we look at maybe Mozambique today and in the next few years, to what extent are these factors that are going to impact on where Mozambique is going in terms of human development?
Yaki, thank you. Your comment about the gas production not being a panacea is actually very interesting, something to really think about. But even that being the case, the gas production is essentially coming from offshore, maritime environment. Now, Mozambique has got a huge coastline, and its ability to do maritime security is virtually non-existent, I think. Has your research shown any policy shifts or thinking from the Mozambican side about how they are going to address their maritime security going forward? Because that is critical to the sustainability and security of these gas fields in the future, I'd suggest. Thank you.
Thanks for that first set of questions, Yaki.
Thanks. Maybe I can start with the latter question. I think the question, in a sense, is linked to what has happened with the almost $2 billion of illegal, unauthorized loans that the Mozambican government embarked upon recently. Because one of the reasons for that, for these loans, were twofold. Well, there were two reasons for this. The one was that Mozambique said we needed a coastal protection unit to protect our offshore gas plants. And the second reason was that they wanted to establish a big tuna fishing project. Now, neither of these justifications, in actual fact, hold any water. You could hire a private security company probably to have looked after your few natural gas if there is a threat to them from an infrastructure point of view, which I don't think exists. I think that but I don't know. We have not done that study. So the security issues around the natural gas production, the offshore facilities, is something that the Mozambicans are quite aware of. But as I've said, they have literally squandered their future benefit by this $2 billion unauthorized loan. In a sense, when we were in Mozambique, we said that Mozambique suffers from a pre-resource curse, because they actually already spent the money, wasted the money, ahead of, in actual fact, getting the money. It's just actually quite tragic in a certain sense. And of course, the companies, the private financial institutions that facilitated the loans and made something like $200 million of profits just by securing these illegal loans, because they are illegal, of course, get off scot-free in the process. But in the international financial institutions have all stopped lending towards the Mozambican government, as they should, because Mozambique has shown that parliamentary oversight did not hold in any of these loans. So the country is suffering severely from the impact of what happened, and it demonstrates the challenges that Mozambique is going to face to manage these levels of income in an effective manner. Because will the income go towards poverty alleviation, or will they go into the pockets of a few small families, and so on? So I think the corruption issue is quite central to Mozambique, and how they manage this. Now, there is a section in the paper that looks at governance, and we modeled governance. Mozambique suffers, I'll maybe just read you one extract from this. Mozambique's capacity, general government capacity, seems to be roughly on par with other countries in the continent. We model governance in terms of 3 dimensions: security, capacity, and inclusion. However, the report continues. The country's government effectiveness score has been trending downward for the past 20 years. The effectiveness score, it's measured by the World Bank. While transparency has been slowly improving, the recent debt scandal has called these improvements into question. In other words, the government of Mozambique's ability to effectively manage revenues has been declining even in the absence of gas revenues. So the prospects at the moment do not appear good. So to what extent is competitive politics serving as a control measure on wastage? And this brings us to what's going to happen with the talks and the agreement that is going to be signed. What we find here is elite agreements between Frelimo and Renamo, which may bring a degree of stability politically at one level, but I wonder if that's going to make any difference to the delivery of services when we look at what's going to happen. So I've not been following, another unit at the Institute has been, I hope, following the talks and what's been happening. My understanding is that the agreement is going to be signed in November or December, and that there may be agreements on the division of certain provinces being given to Renamo to run, but this question is what happens to the MRM. I don't know. We've not followed that closely in what the outcome of the talks would be. But Mozambique faces a relatively turbulent future, given its high youth bulge and insecurity and the legacy of the war. So it needs a secure future, and that secure future is going to be difficult I think, to achieve. Liesl, I didn't completely understand the point that you were making with regard to the. Would you maybe like to rephrase it? Okay.
I just wanted to know how the corruption and politics are figures in all of
Yeah. I think we all recognize that levels of corruption, the lack of transparency in Mozambique and to an extent in Angola, I'm not sure if that's a legacy of a particular, Portuguese colonialism, that is really a challenge that the countries grapple in. But what is interesting is that the expected level of inclusion or democracy, if you want to, in Mozambique is a little bit higher than you would actually expect given its level of development. But that's maybe a different issue.
Yeah, okay, I was wondering, you showed in your paper that Mozambique is already very energy dependent in terms of its contribution to GDP. The inclusion of this natural gas and its contribution to GDP, wouldn't that make Mozambique more vulnerable to external shocks in the long term? And how would Mozambique address those potential external shocks in diversifying its economy beyond agriculture? That was my question, and I will take another round of questions as well. In the absence, okay.
We included in the analysis and the forecast is, I'll finish this one and then we can, a forecast on, what happens with the Mozambican economy. And of course, given its large subsistence agricultural sector, agriculture has huge potential to sustain livelihoods and provide employment because gas is not going to provide that. So the services sector dominate the Mozambican economy, but clearly when it comes to general livelihoods, going up the agricultural curve, whatever term one wants to use, I think is very important for Mozambique. Related to that, the problem is that they have, I think, something like tripled agricultural production, largely through an expansion of land under cultivation during the last 20 or 30 years. The figures are in the study, and that we believe there's considerable potential to increase productivity as well as increase land use. But that even under those scenarios, Mozambique at the moment is likely to increase its food import bill or dependency, and that does open it up to various shocks. And then there's also the potential impact of climate change. We've seen increased evidence of large events, floods and hurricanes and so on, that have an impact on Mozambique. So the country struggles with resilience above all the other challenges.
Thank you, Aki. Do we have further questions? Okay.
Thank you for another informative presentation. I have an addition to the question related to external shocks, that this sudden discovery of natural resources, obviously that will have some implications, some challenges, and what I would term this inverted commas in terms of friendly foreign intervention, that to benefit or to capitalize on these resources. So Mozambique, where does it look up to, or how it will unfold in terms of capitalizing on these resources? Because that is very important, that how Mozambique will benefit from these natural resources in 15-20 years. Thank you.
Any further questions?
We're being let off easily today. Mozambique is next to the second largest economy in Africa, South Africa. So its obvious orientation is to South Africa. Over time, Tanzania and Kenya and others may also prospects are improving, but the challenges for Tanzania in particular is that its development prospects are also determined by LNG gas. And not only has the global market shrunk, but the ability of foreigners, or the willingness of foreign investment in a large gas production has declined. But having said that, in the forecasts that we've done on the future of South Africa, we argue it's in Fate of the Nation, the book that we put out on the future of South Africa, that for South Africa's future energy prospects can be well met by fracking, importing national gas from Mozambique, and not going nuclear. We don't need, for a variety of reasons, the nuclear project seems to be driven by other considerations rather than efficiency or cost effectiveness, or in actual fact even energy demand. So South Africa, which is Mozambique's largest potential market, onshore market, is a major partner for Mozambique, and in almost in every aspect of Mozambique's development. Of course, when we speak of LNG, apart from export of gas, which is the other natural determinant that is beyond Mozambique's control, because the global gas price will determine. So I think that what's going to happen in South Africa and in the region will have a huge impact on Mozambique. At some point, Zimbabwe's fortunes will turn around, and prospects will improve. Mozambique is the natural gateway of Zimbabwe, landlocked Zimbabwe, Malawi, and others, and should, in theory, be able to benefit from a fairly rapid growth of landlocked African countries. That has not materialized to the extent that I think Mozambicans and others have thought would be possible. I think that's the other major consideration.
You made a point in the report that barring a major migratory event, the core drivers of population growth are changes in fertility rate and life expectancy. Looking at the way these new natural resources actually attract ancillary businesses around them, did you factor in the relationship between that and a potential migratory move towards Mozambique to benefit from these new economic boon?
I don't think so, to be quite honest. The jobs that are going to be provided by the gas boom is not going to benefit ordinary Mozambique, is going to be relatively small. So the question is, if the general progress that we are going to see in Mozambique, if that is going to attract migrants from elsewhere, and Mozambique's inward and outward migration has been largely determined by instability in the fighting in the north and what's happened in South Africa to an extent, but largely in Zimbabwe. So there are actually large swings in population movements and migratory patterns in the region. But my sense would be that a lot's going to depend what happens in South Africa. But Mozambique comes off such a low base that it's, I'm not sure that it is going to attract additional large migratory populations from elsewhere in the continent, because some of the other countries, Malawi and so on, face many of the same kind of challenges. You have three upper middle income countries, South Africa, Namibia and Botswana, which serve as a magnet to a degree of inward movement, including from Mozambique. So the challenge is, in a sense, how many Mozambicans are going to continue coming to South Africa, and what is the impact of continued poverty in Mozambique on rhino poaching and so on. There's been a symbiosis in organized crime patterns between Mozambique and South Africa for many, many years. Years ago, it was the export of vehicles from South Africa. That has changed. It's now much more rhino and elephant tusk and that kind of export. I'm not sure, Zach, if you want to add anything to this.
Are there any further questions for Yaki or Zach at this point? Okay. In the absence of any further questions, Zach, Yaki, thank you very much for those very thought-provoking and forward-looking presentations, and we hope that you'd be able to pick up copies of these publications which are outside the door. The research that you conducted is actually a testament to the Institute for Security Studies, leveraging its donor community, in this case, Irish Aid and Hans Hedel Foundation, which we are grateful for, to actually enhance its collaboration with African governments and provide forward-looking, policy-oriented solutions to the many developmental challenges that they will be facing down the road, looking towards 2040. These are challenges which are continental. They also fall within the African Union's Agenda 2063, which looks beyond 2040. And this kind of research actually would help in empirically informing exactly the choices that government and other policymakers have to engage with different countries within the continent. And while it's not continental, specific and micro studies on the different countries would actually provide innovative insights on how to address these issues without necessarily developing this large-scale macro development programming. As you all zero in into issues, social issues like education, healthcare service provision, and governance as main drivers of potential change for development within these countries. Thank you very much again for putting this report together. Thank you for being here today as well to present it in very clear and lucid terms. The videos as well were very, very insightful and informative, and I'm sure that those who were not here with us today would be able to benefit from those videos. Thank you to our online audience and those who could make it here today. We are always grateful when you join us for these seminars and when you have thought-provoking questions which actually reshape the way we think and conceived of these issues. I would still like to thank our different partners from the ISS Partnership Forum, which include the Hans Hedel Foundation, as well as the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the USA. For those of you here, we have a few refreshments outside and would be able to carry this discussion forward. And please do not hesitate to engage Yaki and Zach on issues even beyond Namibia and Mozambique. Thank you very much for coming.